An old veteran, lost in memories, couldn't remember his way home. What would you do? So the bus driver kept driving hour after hour, gentle as the rain, listening to stories of distant battles, of friends long gone. Each stop, he asked, "Is this the place?" Each time, the veteran shook his head, searching for a memory buried deep, until finally he remembered a place with white columns and an ancient oak waiting in the dawnlight. And that's when everything changed, not just for one night, but for a lifetime. Welcome to Graceful Valor Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The rain had been falling for hours. It slipped down the cracked windows of the city bus in shimmering streaks, catching the glow of the faded street lamps. David Cooper sat behind the wheel, hands loose on the steering wheel, eyes soft as he watched the city outside blur into a hazy watercolor of light and shadow. He was a man who had grown used to the quiet weight of the night. This was his final route of the evening, Route 17, the one that always felt more like a confession than a job. It was a simple city, small enough that everyone seemed to know each other's names, small enough that the rain itself felt like a familiar song. Tonight, the streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional cab that splashed past, headlights flickering like restless ghosts. David liked these hours. No chatter of the rush hour crowd, no bright laughter echoing from the bars, just the hum of the old engine, the steady sigh of the windshield wipers, and the gentle warmth of the bus's heater on his knees. In the rear-view mirror, the seats sat mostly vacant, faded blue upholstery, worn smooth by years of stories he knew. Most nights, the last passenger was someone rushing to make it home to a late dinner or a tired child. But tonight, there was no rush. There was only the rain and the promise of one last quiet ride through the sleeping city. As he turned onto Elmwood Avenue, David spotted the figure waiting at the next stop. It was an old man hunched beneath a battered army jacket, the brim of his hat drooping low to shield his face. He stood in the glow of the flickering streetlight, cane in hand, shoulders hunched against the cold. David pulled the bus to a stop and opened the doors with a soft hiss of air. The old man took his time. He stepped up slowly, the water dripping from the brim of his hat onto the rubber floor. His eyes lifted for a moment, and David saw something there, something distant and yet steady, a kind of quiet determination that seemed to weather even the night evening. "Sir," David said, voice warm, gentle, "where to tonight?" The old man paused, blinking like he was trying to remember why he was even there. His voice was low, a little hoarse. "But sure, I'm looking for Evergreen," he said. "Evergreen? The nursing home? But I can't quite remember where it is." David nodded slowly. "That's all right," he said softly, "we'll find it together." The old man gave him a small, grateful smile. It was the kind of smile that carried a lifetime of polite refusals, a lifetime of trying not to be a burden. He shuffled down the aisle, moving carefully, and sank into the first seat behind David. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The bus pulled away from the curb, tires hissing on wet pavement. The wipers whispered back and forth, matching the slow rhythm of the city's heart. David adjusted the rearview mirror, stealing another glance at his quiet passenger. The old man was staring out the window as if searching for something he'd lost a long time ago. After a while, he spoke again, his voice soft and worn. "This is Route 17, isn't it?" David glanced back, surprised. "That's right," he said. "You know this line?" The old man gave a slow nod, his eyes never leaving the glass. "I always took Route 17, he said, "even when I was young, back from the war. This was my road home." David let the words sink in like rain soaking into dry ground. The old man's voice was steady, but there was a weight behind it. Like every word was carrying the memories of 100 nights just like this one. David kept his eyes on the road, but his voice was gentle when he asked, "Do you remember anything else about Evergreen, a landmark? Maybe?" The old man hesitated, his brow furrowing in thought. I think there was a big oak tree," he murmured, "and white columns at the front, but it's been years." He fell silent again, a faint sigh escaping his lips. David didn't press him. He knew the feeling of memory slipping through your fingers like water. Instead, he just nodded. "All right," he said quietly, "let's keep driving, we'll find it." They moved slowly through the sleeping streets. The rain made everything seem softer, more forgiving. They past empty bus stops, the shelter roofs glistening with rain. The old man's eyes drifted from one window to the next, searching for something only he could see. Every few minutes, David would ask in that same calm voice, "Is this it, sir? Does this look familiar?" And every time, the old man would shake his head slowly. No, not yet." But he didn't sound worried, he sounded patient, like he trusted that somehow someway the road would lead him home. Can one night change a life? The bus rumbled past shuttered shops and darkened houses. David kept his hands loose on the wheel, his shoulders relaxed. He knew there was no schedule to keep tonight, no one waiting for this bus but the old man in the seat behind him, and that was all right. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, there was only the low hum of the heater, the slow rise and fall of the old man's breathing. David didn't ask any more questions. He just let the silence stretch between them, soft and steady, like the gentle roll of the bus over the wet roads. In that silence, the old man began to speak again, not about Evergreen, but about the places he'd been. He spoke of battles fought on faraway shores, of friends who never made it back, Of the way the ocean looked at dawn, when the world was so quiet you could almost forget the weight of it all. David listened, his eyes on the road, his heart open. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes or empty comfort. He just listened and let the words of a life lived wash over him. The old man's voice was a soft thread, weaving through the rain and the night. It was a voice that didn't ask to be heard, but deserved it all the same. And David, quiet, kind David, knew that was all he needed to give, just a seat on a bus, just a warm cabin in a cold city, and the promise that he would keep driving as long as it took, as long as the old man needed. And in that simple promise, beneath the quiet hush of the rain, something gentle and profound took root, something that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be real. The promise that the last passenger of the night would never be left behind. The bus rolled on through the rain-slick streets, its headlights carving slow arcs of light through the darkness. David kept his hands steady on the wheel, his posture relaxed, his expression calm. He glanced in the mirror every few blocks, meeting the old man's gaze, always patient. Does this look like it? He asked as they turned down Oak Ridge Lane. The old man would lift his head, peer through the foggy glass, then shake it slowly. No, he'd say, voice soft, but sure, not this one, but it's close, I can feel it. David just nodded, easing the bus back onto the main road. He didn't mind the quiet drive or the slow crawl through the sleeping city. There was something about the old man's presence that made him feel like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The rain kept falling, tapping softly against the windshield, a steady, gentle percussion. The old man began to speak again, his voice carrying over the low hum of the heater. He didn't talk about Evergreen anymore. He talked about the war, about the boys he fought beside, the songs they sang to keep the night at bay. David didn't interrupt, didn't glance back too often. He just drove, the streets blurring by in the rain, and let the words wash over him. The old man spoke of fields that burned at dusk and nights so cold you could feel your bones singing with the chill. He spoke of a friend named Walter who'd always carried a harmonica in his breast pocket. He played it every night, the old man said, his voice steady, even when the shells fell. He played, said music was the only way to keep the ghosts away. David could almost hear it, that thin reedy note rising above the gunfire. He didn't know what to say, so he didn't say anything. Sometimes listening was the only kindness you could offer. They stopped at every corner where a white fence or a flickering porch light reminded the old man of something. David would pull the bus to a slow halt, turn in his seat just a little. Here, he'd ask, his tone warm, never impatient. The old man would squint into the rain, searching the shadows for a familiar shape. No, he'd murmur, his shoulders sagging, not yet. And David would smile, ease the bus back into gear, and keep going. They drove past the old post office with its cracked brick walls, past the shuttered hardware store, where a single bulb flickered in the window. Each place was like a checkpoint on an invisible map only the old man could see. He kept talking, his stories weaving through the night like a quiet river. He told David about the day the war ended, how the men had danced in the mud, laughing like boys again, how they drank watered-down whiskey and sang songs in languages they didn't even know. David let the images play out in his mind, painting them across the wet streets as they drove. He felt like he was carrying them, these memories that had survived longer than the men who'd lived them. Every so often, the old man would stop talking and just stare out the window. The rain drummed softly on the roof and the silence was comfortable, a soft kind of peace that David didn't want to break. When he did speak, it was only to ask the same question, always gentle. Is this it, sir? And always the same shake of the head. No, not this one. But the old man never seemed discouraged. He just kept looking, eyes bright beneath the brim of his hat, as if he believed that somewhere ahead the road would bend toward home. David believed it, too. The bus rolled on, past sleeping houses and quiet intersections. Sometimes they passed other cars, but mostly the city belonged to them. Two men and the soft glow of the dashboard lights. The old man's voice would trail off into quiet, only to pick up again when they turned another corner. He spoke of a winter so cold that breath froze in midair, of letters that never arrived, of a promise he'd made to his mother before he left. Always come home, he said, almost to himself, always find your way back. David swallowed, feeling those words settle deep in his chest. He wondered if that was what they were doing now, fulfilling a promise made so long ago. At one point, they pulled over by a small church, its steeple dark against the sky. The old man stared at it for a long time, brow furrowed. It looks like the chapel in Bastonia, he murmured, where we lit candles for the ones we'd lost. David didn't rush him, he just sat, the engine idling, and let the old man have that moment. When the old man finally shook his head, David offered a small, quiet smile. Not this one, either, huh? The old man's eyes met his in the mirror. No, he said softly, but thank you for stopping. David just nodded and pulled the bus back onto the road. They kept going deeper into the night. At every block, at every cross street, David would slow, asking the same question. The old man's answers never changed, but neither did the trust in his voice, the way he said, thank you. Each time they started forward again. Outside, the rain began to ease, a soft drizzle that glistened on the pavement. The city seemed to breathe a little easier. the air rich with the scent of wet earth and quiet streets. Inside the bus, David felt something shift, not in the way of grand gestures or sudden revelations, but in the slow, steady certainty that sometimes the smallest kindness was the one that mattered most. Will this kindness be rewarded? The old man's stories went on, a patchwork of memories that blurred the line between past and present. He spoke of men who never got to grow old, of letters that smelled like home, of nights spent staring at the stars and wondering if the world would ever be the same. David didn't rush him, he didn't fill the silences with empty words, he just drove, letting the old man's voice fill the cabin, soft as the rain outside. At each stop, he would ask here, and the old man would answer, not yet, until finally, the old man fell quiet. He leaned back in his seat, hands folded on his lap, eyes half closed, but still watchful. David glanced back, his own heart slowing to match the rhythm of the night. You okay, sir? He asked softly. The old man nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. I'm all right, he said. You're a good man, son. I can see that. David didn't know how to answer, so he didn't. He just let the words settle around him, warm as the heater on a cold night. The bus kept moving, steady and sure outside. The city was still and silent inside. The old man's voice was a soft echo of a life that refused to be forgotten, and David, quiet, patient David, knew he would keep driving as long as it took, because sometimes it wasn't about the destination, it was about the promise to never let someone travel alone. And in that promise, beneath the soft patter of the rain, David found a quiet purpose that no timetable or schedule could ever take away. The rain had eased into a gentle mist by the time the sky began to pale, hints of dawn creeping up behind the city skyline. David glanced in the mirror and saw the old man staring ahead, eyes soft but focused. For a moment, the silence felt deeper, like the city itself was holding its breath. Then the old man's hand lifted, trembling slightly. There, he said, his voice low but clear, there's an oak tree and white columns. I remember them. David's heart gave a small jolt, hope sparking in his chest. Columns and big oak? He asked, turning his head just enough to see the old man's eyes. The old man nodded slowly. Yes, evergreen has white columns at the front and a great oak tree that's been there longer than I have. David's lips curved into a quiet smile. I know where that is, he said gently. Hold on, sir, we're almost there. He guided the bus down familiar streets, the way clear in his mind. It wasn't far, just a few more turns, a few more gentle stops. As they drew closer, David slowed the bus, turning onto a narrow road lined with sycamores. The old man leaned forward, his breath fogging the window. I see it, he whispered. There, do you see it? David nodded, his heart steady as he brought the bus to a soft stop. In the soft glow of the morning light, evergreen stood quiet and still. White columns framed the entrance and the great oak tree spread its branches wide, leaves glistening in the damp air. David put the bus in park and turned to face the old man. Here we are, he said softly. The old man's eyes shone, and for the first time that night, David saw them clear and sharp. He rose slowly from his seat, using his cane for balance, and shuffled forward. When he reached the front of the bus, he paused. For a moment, he just stood there, one hand resting on the worn metal pole. Then he turned to David, his expression full of something too deep for words. I wouldn't have found it alone, he said, his voice quiet but certain. David shook his head. You would have, sir, you just needed a little help remembering. The old man's hand reached out, fingers wrapping around David's in a grip that was surprisingly strong. I won't forget you, he said. Route 17, David Cooper, I'll remember. David felt a lump form in his throat, but he managed a small smile. I'm glad, sir, he said softly. Take care of yourself. The old man held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a small nod. He stepped off the bus and onto the wet pavement, his cane tapping softly as he made his way to the door of Evergreen. David watched him go, the shape of him framed by the pale light of dawn. The doors of the nursing home opened slowly, and the old man turned back. One last time, he lifted his hand in a quiet salute. Nothing grand, just a simple gesture of respect. David lifted his own in return, and for a moment they stood like that, two men joined by a single silent promise. Then the old man turned and disappeared into the warmth of the building. David let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of the night settle around him. He sat for a moment longer, listening to the gentle tap of the rain on the roof, the soft hum of the engine beneath him. Then he eased the bus back onto the road, heading home with the faintest hint of sunrise in his rear-view mirror. For weeks afterward, David thought of the old man whenever he passed Evergreen. He wondered if he was sitting by the window, watching the rain and remembering old songs. He wondered if he still whispered the number 17 under his breath, the way he had on that long, gentle ride through the city. But he never saw the old man again, not until a year later, when a man in a dark suit stepped onto his bus at the end of a shift. David recognized him as a lawyer, sharp suit, quiet eyes, a briefcase that looked expensive. David Cooper, the man asked. David nodded slowly. Yes, that's me. The lawyer gave a small, polite smile. I represent the estate of Mr. Charles Miles, he said. David felt his breath catch. Charles, the old man from Evergreen. The lawyer nodded. He passed away a few weeks ago, he said gently. He left behind a small estate and a very specific bequest for you. David blinked, the weight of Those words sinking in. I don't understand, he said softly. The lawyer reached into his briefcase and withdrew a manila envelope. Inside was a letter written in a shaky but deliberate hand. David unfolded it, his fingers trembling. David, thank you for driving me home that night, thank you for listening, for not rushing me, for letting me remember. I didn't have much left to leave behind, but there's one thing I want you to have, my old car. She's not much to look at, but she's been with me longer than most people ever stayed. She's yours now. Take her out once in a while, let her feel the road again, and know that I meant it when I said I'd remember you. David read the words twice, his throat tight. He looked up at the lawyer, who offered a small smile. It's a 1946 Ford Coupe, he said. Mr. Miles always called it not worth much, but our appraiser estimates it's worth at least $50,000. David's eyes widened. $50,000, he breathed. The lawyer nodded. Vintage, fully restored, he kept it in perfect condition all these years. David felt the weight of that, of the car, of the old man's quiet generosity settle around him like the hush of dawn. I don't know what to say, he murmured. You don't have to say anything, the lawyer replied. Mr. Miles said it all. David folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into the envelope. He thought of that night, the rain on the windows, the way the old man's voice had filled the bus like music. He thought of the promise he'd made, silent, but real, to never leave anyone behind, and he realized that somehow, in some small way, he had kept it. The lawyer handed him a set of keys, worn smooth by time and memory. She's parked in a garage not far from here, he said. Would you like me to show you? David nodded slowly. Yes, he said quietly. I'd like that very much. As he stepped off the bus and followed the lawyer into the morning light, he felt the weight of the old man's final gift settle deep in his chest. A car, a story, a memory that would never fade, and in that simple act of remembrance, David found something he'd been giving to others all along, the quiet knowledge that kindness never goes unnoticed, not in this world, not ever. The garage was old, its wooden doors weathered by decades of rain and sun. David stepped inside slowly, the air cool and still. In the dim light, he saw the car waiting for him, a 1946 Ford Coupe, its curved fenders glistening faintly beneath a thin layer of dust. He moved closer, fingertips tracing the smooth lines of the hood. It was beautiful in the way that old things often are, solid, dependable, carrying the weight of years with quiet pride. He imagined the old man behind the wheel, the rumble of the engine beneath him, the long road stretching out ahead. David let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. The lawyer watched him with a small smile. Take your time, he said softly. David nodded. He opened the driver's side door, the hinges creaking gently, and settled into the worn leather seat. It smelled of oil and memories, of a life that had seen both war and peace. His hands rested on the steering wheel, and for a moment, he closed his eyes. He could almost hear the old man's voice in the hush of the garage. Not worth much, he'd said, but David knew better. Some things weren't about the money, they were about the stories they carried, the hands that had held them, the miles they had traveled. He turned the key in the ignition, and the engine rumbled to life, a deep, steady growl that felt like a heartbeat. Outside, the morning light slipped through the cracks in the door, painting the car in soft gold. David smiled, a quiet curve of his lips. This wasn't just a car, it was a promise, a memory, a gift given freely by a man who had lived long enough to know what truly mattered. Over the next few days, word of the old man's bequest spread quietly through the city. At first, it was just a story shared over coffee at the diner, a bus driver who had spent one long night driving a lost veteran home. But the story didn't stop there. The local paper picked it up, printing a small article on the last page. They called it The Final Ride, a story of kindness and patience of a man who had asked for nothing and yet found himself remembered. Soon a local veterans group reached out to David. Their leader was a tall man named Frank Weller, his hair silver at the temples, his handshake firm and warm. He came to the bus depot one evening, standing quietly by the curb as David stepped down from his last run of the night. David Cooper, he asked, his voice low but steady. David nodded, a little surprised. Yes, he said. Frank extended his hand. I'm with the Riverside Veterans Association, he said. We wanted to thank you on behalf of all of us. David felt a flush rise to his cheeks. I just did what anyone would have done, he said quietly, but Frank shook his head, a small knowing smile in his eyes. Not everyone would have done it, he said. Not everyone would have sat in that driver's seat all night, listening to a man's memories, never rushing him home. David looked down at his hands, still rough from years on the wheel. It didn't feel like much, he murmured. It felt like the right thing. Frank nodded. It was, he said simply, and we think people should know about it. They invited him to a small ceremony at the Veterans Hall the following week. David hesitated at first. He'd never been one for recognition, but when he arrived, he saw that it wasn't about medals or speeches. It was about faces lined and weathered, young and old, turning toward him with quiet gratitude. Frank spoke for the group, his voice calm, words measured. He talked about the power of listening, of small kindnesses that echo long after they're given. He talked about how David had given one man a chance to be seen, to be remembered. When Frank finished, he handed David a small plaque engraved simply with his name and the date of that final ride. David took it with both hands, the weight of it solid and real. He didn't say much, just a quiet thank you, his voice steady. Afterward, he stepped outside into the cool evening air. The city lay quiet around him, lights blinking softly in the distance. He thought of the old man's last words. "I'll remember," and he realized that sometimes remembrance was all a person needed. The local paper ran a second story the next day, this time on the front page. They called it A Quiet Hero, and for a while, David found himself the subject of small-town conversation. People stopped him on the street to shake his hand, to tell him they'd read about the ride, but David never let it change him. He still drove the night route, the same gentle smile on his face, the same patient voice calling out each stop. He didn't seek out the attention, he didn't need it. For him, it had never been about the headlines or the plaque hanging on the wall of the Veterans Hall. It was about that single night, the soft rain on the windows, and an old man's stories that had deserved to be heard, about the promise he'd made to never leave someone alone in the dark, and about how in the quietest moments, the smallest kindness can leave the deepest mark. The Ford Coupe sat in his driveway, gleaming in the pale morning light. Sometimes on Sundays, he'd take it out onto the back roads, the engine purring under his hands. It wasn't about showing off, it was about keeping a memory alive, about letting the wheels turn the way they were meant to. Neighbors would wave as he passed, and he'd tip his cap in return, but he never boasted. He never said much at all because he knew that the story wasn't really his, it belonged to the old man, to the veterans who watched from the windows of Evergreen, to anyone who had ever felt the weight of being forgotten. It was a story of giving without asking, of listening without judgment, and it was a story that would last quiet and steady long after the last page was turned. David Cooper still drove the night bus, still watched the city slide past his window, the rain still a soft song in his ears, but now there was something else in his eyes, a quiet pride, warm and unwavering, because he knew that sometimes just by being there, just by offering a seat, a listening ear, a patient smile, you could change everything. He didn't need to be known for it, he didn't need to be thanked. It was enough to know that he had been seen, and that in one long night, he had seen someone else in return, and in that simple act given freely, without fanfare, he had found a kind of grace that no plaque or story could ever take away. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition, some just need to know that today someone isn't going hungry, and sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.